Assalamu alaikum everyone. Welcome back to the official YouTube channel of the Islamabad Policy Research Institute. My name is Ikra Banu Suhail and I am a research associate with the Chair International Law here at IPRI. Today's episode marks the World Day Against Child Labour, a day that calls on all of us to reflect on a persistent and a very painful global issue. We all know that despite the existence of various laws and international commitments, millions of children around the world are still stuck in this exploitative cycle, often at the cost of their education, at the cost of their health, and even at the cost of their dignity. So in this episode, we will unpack all the factors that are keeping child labor alive in Pakistan, from legal loopholes and economic policies that often end up prioritizing profits over people, to your international commitments and our deep embedded societal norms. We will talk about why child labor still persists and what can be done realistically in order to tackle it. To talk on that, we have Mr. Shahzeb Usman joining us today, who is a Pakistani legal scholar and a legal researcher specializing in human rights, labor laws, and economic policy. He serves as a lecturer of international law at the National University of Science and Technology. His work often focuses on the intersection of law and economics, with a focus on accountability mechanisms for international financial institutions. He completed his LLM from the University of Nottingham as a developing solutions scholar and his BA LLB from the Lahore University of Management Sciences. So Shahzeb, welcome to the podcast and thank you so much for joining us today.
Good to be back to our host studio.
We're really glad to have you.
Yeah.
So Shahzeb, let's just start off with the legal aspect of the issue. So we know that various laws exist in Pakistan, specifically when it comes to prohibiting child labor. But despite these laws, the issue still remains widespread. Can you walk us through the major legal loopholes in Pakistani legislation that either implicitly allow or fail to effectively prevent this evil?
Okay. I think law itself is not a big issue, I would say. And I think we will discuss that in detail later in the podcast, that why is it not a big issue. But on the start, I will just say 2 or 3 things about law.
Okay.
And I think that's pretty much the only things that you will find in relation to loopholes within the labor law. The one is, I don't think so that the Pakistani labor law addresses domestic workers. So we do have legislations in all provinces. You know, we have it in Punjab, Sindh, KPK, Balochistan, Islamabad Capital Territory. And they all prohibit, labor of people under 14 or 15. But we don't have legislation, especially in, I would say, Balochistan and Sindh, which deals with domestic workers. So kind of, all these legislations that are available, they're talking about an establishment. An establishment, the law is only applicable on establishment. What is establishment? It would be something like a place where you can have for-profit employment. And there's some kind of manufacturing or service sector industry is there. But unfortunately, the houses where most of the children are working, they are not covered under these legislations. So there's kind of like a gap in the law. It is only focusing on, factories. It is only focusing on offices. It's not focusing on the homes, especially in 2 or 3 provinces. So I think that's a big legal loophole. And I think most of the children, unfortunately, are employed in these settings where most of the exploitation occurs. The second, I would say, is in relation to fragmentation of the law, I feel. In different provinces, I think the age for, minimum age for working is defined differently. In some provinces it's 14, some provinces it's 15. And I feel that sometimes it creates that disruption. There should be a unified legislation all across Pakistan, because I think Pakistani constitution says that every child is entitled to education till 16.
Yes.
So why 14 and 15? I understand that ILO allows you to have it till 14 and 15. But I think since you're saying in your constitution that it has to be till 16, then I think we should also allow, there should be no working below 16.
Yes.
Why are we allowing 14 or 15? The third thing I would say that it's also in relation to after 14 till 18, in most of the legislation, it defines a child as adolescent. So sometimes child is defined under 14 and there's another category called adolescent from 14 to 18. I feel that is also a big problem, because from 14 to 18, they can work, but they can't work in hazardous conditions. What is a hazardous condition?
Yes.
That is something that they have listed, but you can't define it completely, right? You can't list all the occupations which are hazardous. There's a limit that you can define it.
Of course.
So they are all defined, I would say, in an exhaustive way, listed in a specific way, which I feel is a problematic way. And then there are legal tests, like very, I would say, fluid legal tests, that there might be some kind of pressure on them. That is a hazardous thing. Now, for a child, 14 to 18 is still a child.
Yes.
I mean, some children grow at certain age, some don't.
Yes.
So I feel that that is also a big problem, that from 14 to 18, a lot of exploitation occurs.
Yeah.
Because the law is allowing it, and they are just saying that you can't allow it in a hazardous condition.
Yes.
Now, what is a hazardous condition? You can't completely define it. And then there's a lot of exploitation in that age bracket. So I think that's also a big issue. And one of the issues that I feel is also in relation to families. The law does not explicitly forbid working in relation to a family capacity.
Okay.
Again, a legal loophole, a gray area is there. What is a family? Okay, I find, if family is a nuclear unit, if I'm working with my father, is it a family? If I'm working even with my extended relative, that is a family. A lot of the time, exploitation occurs in a family
In the
capacity.
families, yes.
So that is also, I think, we need to define what exactly it means working with the family.
So like a next to kin or something like
yeah,
that.
is it your extended relative? A lot of the time exploitation, as you know,
Yes.
happens in relation, I'm not saying nuclear family or immediate family, but extended family. A lot of the time we have seen cases where children are being given to the extended family who are their rich relatives.
Yes.
They're working as a domestic worker. So I think a lot of the loopholes are in relation to all of these things that I can flag out from my mind.
Okay, so that's very interesting to hear. You mentioned the hazardous conditions, right? So do you think any sort of like psychological impact should also be covered within that definition?
There is a covered, but again, what is psychological impact? A child who is like 15.
Yeah.
I mean, just by working somewhere in a mechanic's shop.
Yeah.
Isn't it a psychological impact on him seeing rich kids going to these fancy places?
Definitely the mental strain
So I mean, this is a very, gray,
I get what you're saying.
slippery slope definition, which you can never really encounter, I think, anywhere else. So I think there should be clarity on this. I don't like this distinction, which law allows, even the international law allows, ILO allows it. But I personally think that in countries like Pakistan, it is a disaster, and it's a recipe for, allowing the slippage from the law.
Okay, so the policies should be unified at the end of the day.
And we have also signed CRC, the Convention on the Rights of Children. Although CRC also carves out this language in such a way that government can make some policies in relation to creating some distinctions between 14 to 18, but it also defines a child under 18.
Okay.
And then it also says that you have to have no economic exploitation of children. So I think in our context, I think it should be just 18 or at least 16. If you really want to conformity with the Constitution of Pakistan, which says that till 16, they're entitled to an education. So if they're entitled to an education, then automatically it means that they should not work.
Yeah.
So that's what I think.
Definitely. So since you also focus on economic policy, how does the global economic system, particularly free trade policies and international investment law, contribute to the persistence or even increase of child labor in countries like Pakistan?
That's my favorite topic. I think a lot of the times I feel that the lawyers are too confident about themselves. And one thing I like about the British system is that they think that the law is a reflection of the society. It's evolution. And once the system has developed, then they kind of codify the law. We are opposite. A lot of the post-colonial countries, as you can see, is all NGO-based, NGO-driven legal legislation, especially in these areas. We make the law, and it doesn't fit well in our local systems.
Yes.
So I think first we really need to figure out, we have made laws, I think, as I said, in laws there are loopholes, but that's not the biggest issue.
Yes.
The biggest issue comes in economic policy. And I'll start with, for example, recently we have signed IMF deals and we have gone into this neoliberalization, free trade. I'll tell you from my study, if you have signed IMF deals, one thing that we do is to increase taxes.
Okay.
If you are increasing taxes are mostly implemented in the formal economy. So if you're increasing taxes, there's more incentive for the businessman because we already have very lack of enforcement. So it's a recipe for people to go into informal economy and to evade the economy at all because they don't want to pay taxes at all. Already they don't want to pay the low taxes, and they also don't make much profit sometimes. So why would they want to make higher profits? So they just go out of the formal economy.
So that's how unregulated market increases at the end of the day.
And when the unregulated market, because most of the child labor actually exists in informal economy or unregulated economy.
Yes.
So a lot of the statistics prove that once we sign these trade liberalization deals with the IMF and generally we go into these economic policies, the informal sector increases. And in the informal sector, a lot of the child labor exists. In fact, the dominant portion of the child labor exists in the informal sector. So that is one thing. The second thing is also the inequality that increases generally. I think some of the economists, I can't remember his name, but he showed empirically that, if you sign one IMF condition, the inequality increases by a certain ratio.
Okay.
And he literally corresponded with one IMF structural adjustment program and one IMF conditionality and how the inequality increased in that
Interesting.
country. And if you see that, actually, the countries that have taken up IMF deals like Argentina or Pakistan, they have one of the most highest inequality. Generally, the countries that have followed trade liberalization or pre-economy, like India, we saw that recently that in India there are just 100 billionaires.
Yes.
And most of the people in India are actually living below the poverty.
Yeah.
Or has far more poverty than Pakistan. Why? Because trade liberalization increases the premium on capital. That's what the word economists use. Premium on capital. If you have capital, that would give you far more return. And if you're a wage holder, the premium decreases. That's a recipe for inequality. Now, the inequality is increasing. Of course, and as IMF conditionalities mostly also results in privatization, the education is privatized, the health is privatized. The wage is not there. What would the poor person do? They would send their children to child labor.
To work, yes.
To work. And also I feel that the third thing that I feel is also, since there is so much disconnect that exists between the rich and poor after these economic policies, and the privatization of education has already resulted, what would happen? If you look from the poor person's perspective, the education that is provided at the government schools or any poor quality schools, I'm not saying all the government schools are poor quality, some of them are really good.
Yeah.
But generally, unfortunately, if you look at the schools where low income communities go, the education that is provided, to be very honest, from their perspective, is a waste of time. Because that education would not result in any job.
Yeah.
I mean, right now we are seeing that even the PhDs, if they don't go from a certain institution, so and so that is generally of the elite institutions, they don't get a job. So the point is that they say that, okay, why do we waste our money and time on these low quality education rather than just sending them to something that would earn them money?
Yeah.
And to be very honest, the economy is designed in such a way that it makes sense for them. So I feel that we would need to serious redistribution of wealth. We need higher taxation on certain quarters that are funneling money outside Pakistan, that are depositing money in very unproductive sectors like real estate, like banking, that does not encourage any manufacturing.
Yes.
We need to push towards that, which results in manufacturing, that construction. And then we need to design the education. We need to have diplomas, short courses, rather than these degree education that synchronizes with this new economy. And I think that's the only way. Otherwise, how many laws do you make? How many legal loopholes?
I agree, yes.
These are the practical realities of this country. The education is poor. It does not help them. It wastes their time. It wastes their money. And they would continue to send them to some practical vocation that will exploit them, but at least provide them bread and butter.
A very interesting perspective for sure. So since we have talked about the domestic legal framework, I also want to know what international law says. So what does it say about child labor? And we have different instruments. We have the ILO conventions. We have ICESCR. So how do they define and prohibit child labor? And what obligations are they placing on states?
I mean, right now we are really disappointed by international law, and I think all of us are. And again, probably international law will disappoint you here too. But I mean, we agree that international law is more about that moral high ground that at least exists for a bar to reach.
At least we know what's right and what's wrong. At least
Yeah.
it has given us that clarity. So in that sense, definitely.
I think again, for countries like Pakistan,
Yeah.
a lot of people criticize international law, but for countries like Pakistan, it is the only way out.
Yeah.
We are a smaller country, and we can't really behave like bullies. So for countries like us, we need some rules and order, and for us, it should work, and we should always
Yes.
follow it. Try to follow it as much as possible. I think that international law, there are ILO conventions, of course. There are two ILO conventions. One is relating to minimum age. It says more or less the same as Pakistani legislation says. It says you can't work under 14, but after 14 you can work in certain conditions. And then there are also ILO conventions that forbids or prohibits any kind of very harmful labor, like working in very carcinogenic environment or working in environment that has a lot of pollutants. So there are ILO conventions, and ILO does have a mechanism of complaint as well.
Okay.
Not an individual can contact ILO, but like a trade union or a employees representative
Okay.
can contact ILO. They do have investigations in very rare circumstances. I personally don't know any investigation that they have launched against Pakistan, but generally they do have investigative measures. But most of the time they just monitor and they ask states to just comply. They don't launch investigation commissions. Sorry. And the second is, of course, the ICECR. Again, it's coming from the human rights law. It also forbids all of these things. So forbids child labor. It also gives an elaborate mechanism in Article 6 and 7 of right to work, how the work should be. It also has a complaint mechanism, which Pakistan optional protocol to ICCR. Pakistan has not ratified it. Pakistan has ratified the ILO things,
Yes.
but we haven't ratified the ICSCR. And then CRC also has an optional protocol that forbids all kinds of exploitation against children. But again, Pakistan has not ratified it.
Okay.
So through human rights perspective, we can't really go. An individual from Pakistan can't really go and
Okay.
complain. But through ILO, through the representative, they can. But at the same time, again, all they can do is monitor, track, put soft pressure on them, reputational damage. These are the things. But one thing that happened, again, it's also something I'm ambivalent about. That was through GSP Plus recently. Again, as a Pakistani, I do not like other countries dictating me. But I also think child labor is a bad thing. So what I do think is that what happened with relation to GSP Plus status was that the European Union asked that if you want these trade preferentials, the trade tariffs, you don't want that, then you need to sign and
Yes.
comply against rules against child labor. And I think Balochistan then also started legislation which probably forbid bonded labor. So a lot of activism came into Pakistani government after that.
Okay.
Because of course then the economic state
Yes.
was there. So that's how the compliance and international law works, through connecting human rights with economic measures. Then it really does work. Otherwise, states try to follow it as much as they can, but the international law can just destroy the reputation a little. Right now, I don't think so anybody cares about reputation about anybody right now. Everybody's reputation is so bad. And I think there are a lot of other things that they're worried about. But I mean, to be very honest, if you think about it, how horrible, this is, I think, the worst form of human nature that we can see. Like we might be having strategic achievements, but what's the benefits of that strategic achievements if our children are not happy?
Yeah.
If we have the highest number of children out of school,
Yeah.
what's the point of any achievement?
No, very concerning, definitely.
Yeah, so that's what I think international law is about. But one thing I think also is in relation to business and human rights. And again, I think that would link to your second question. I remember, again, I will not name that company.
Okay.
Because I don't want any damages against me.
Okay.
Because I can't have the proof. But there's an academic paper that actively quotes that company.
Okay.
And that used to just export footballs or I think a sports equipment somewhere outside Pakistan. And there was a lot of criticism on them that they're using child labor. So what happened is that, and there was also criticism against the company that was buying footballs from them. So a lot of the time what these companies do, they create fake certification agencies.
Okay.
They create fake certification agencies to, fulfill all these business and human rights obligations. And those fake agencies provide them the certifications. And that sometimes increases their value because they can say no child labor. Like, for example, they used to say that no animal fat is there.
So like all the due diligence, everything.
And that's all fake. That's all on paper. And very big organizations have been doing that. And sometimes they create total fake. Sometimes even the big organizations, certification agencies, are complicit. And a lot of the time, certification agencies, especially in relation to business and human rights, they are in cahoots with these corporations. And in fact, their value increases after this certification. And it's all on paper. What is happening? And most of the time, it happens after the trade liberalization, because these kind of problems are like nobody cares in Pakistan, to be honest. But these kind of problems occurs when international organizations are buying things from you. So just to put it on paper, they do these things too. So that is also one of the perils of your liberalization. So you mentioned the familial context of child labor as well, the societal mindset that exists in the society, and I was able to understand the cultural context, right? So how does the cultural acceptance of child labor contribute to its persistence and make society complicit basically in violating children's rights? Exactly. I think that is a very good question. And from what I know of it, the culture is something which I feel is a very sociological idea. I can't define culture, you can't define culture, she can't define culture. And I think let the sociologists define culture. I don't think so they have even done it yet, despite so many papers that they write, whatever they say. But the point is that the culture, I think, at least in my understanding or in my observation, culture is not defined by anything else except economics.
Okay.
If you look at England society, if you read these Charles Dickens novels, if you read these Victorian era novels, you would see that child labor was extreme in England, and even when England was at the height of the British Empire, Pax Britannica or whatever, and you read these novels like Oliver Twist, and there's a lot of child labor happening in England in the late 1800s. And that's not just novel, that's actually true. I think in English society, things started changing after World War II, after Prime Minister Clement Attlee introduces these very socially, I would say, socialist reforms, I would say, very pro-labor reforms. That happened only after World War II. So even when England was accumulating all the wealth in the world, and now they are like the champions of the human rights, they were doing, that culture had a lot of child labor just 70, 80 years ago. So is it culture then? Probably not. Cultures evolve, I think. Cultures evolve as a result of economic issues.
Okay.
And I feel that once people are reacting to the economic incentives, the culture also starts to change. And I think a lot of change has occurred in Pakistani society in the last 80, 40 years because of the economic reasons. So as I said, if we start serious consideration and changes in economic policy. I'll just give you one example. Pakistan has the highest proportion of indirect taxes. Indirect taxes are those taxes that I have paid even on this tea.
Okay.
GST plus. Like all these duties that are, charged on the spot. They are not, the rich and poor pay them equally. All these petroleum levies, if you buy 1 liter of petrol, you're paying probably 100 rupees of tax or something right now. Rich and poor pay at the same level. Now, an direct taxation is very less because it's difficult to enforce. Very rich lobbies are impacted. Right now, we are even decreasing the corporate tax because we want to encourage investment and so on and so forth. So I think if we use the tax policies, if we start taxing the rich in a proper way and stop loading the poor with taxes, we will free up a lot of their money. Second, if we start investing in some of the basic things that the poor needs, housing, health, and education and food. These things, especially I would say housing, because housing is the biggest problem that the poor face. It keeps them in the cycle of poverty because most of their income is going in this very unproductive rent-seeking arrangement. I think if we start investing in these things, and right now we are privatizing it. I mean, we are the only country, even the most capitalist countries in the world haven't privatized education and health.
But we are.
But we are doing it. And I don't know what kind of, necro-capitalism they're following. They call it necro-capitalism. It's not even normal capitalism. But if we stop like freeing poor from that, I'm not saying we should just have a revolution or anything right now, but if we start just redirecting our policies where the poor have some money saved up, they will start investing in their children. And then the incentive structure will change, the economic structure will change, the economics will move towards more manufacturing, will move towards more formal sector. The taxes for the government will eventually also increase because the economic activity will be increasing. But the incentives will be to send their children to the formal education and then through the formal sector, and that will reduce child labor. And that will change the culture itself. Right now, the economic structure is incentivizing this culture. And all of us, you, me, she, we would have some extended relative or anybody we have gone and we have seen somebody having. It's very near to. You can't, and I mean, you can't do anything. And then they give very lame excuses that, we are kind of benefiting them.
And we're taking a lot of care.
And it doesn't happen like that. If you really care about them, just start giving them an education.
For sure.
Don't make them work. Would you want your child to work at this age? No. So they say we are kind of brought them out of poverty to our home. It's like we are like angels for them. You are breaking the law, and I think there should be a jail for it. And by the way, there's also one thing that I forgot in the first question. There's very weak penalties. I think in the Punjab legislation there was like 50,000 fine or 6 months prison. And
that's nothing.
That's nothing. So I'm not a big fan of retributive justice. I want rehabilitation, but at least the penalty should be enough to.
But for something like this,
to deter them. And so there is no consequences. 50,000 is nothing for these people, and even 6 months prison after all the legal process. 6 months is there. So I think we need to really also create some more harder punishments for these people.
So Shahzad, to end this conversation, I want to ask you, what should a multi-pronged solution to child labor in Pakistan look like, and how realistic is it under the current political and economic climate to tackle this issue? Like, I want realistic answers.
Realistically, I can't say. I mean, realistically, again, as I said in the previous answers, economic policy has to change. So I'll not repeat myself there, but I think that if we start reorienting our economic policy, and that would really need an inclusive democracy. I mean, some people really quote that book that we need of Darren Acemoglu, Why Nations Fail. I mean, you might be a fan of it or not a fan of it, but I think he has one point. I mean, he says that when there is an extractive elite and there is an exploitative state structure. When they both combine, it's a recipe for disaster, and that's what's happening right now. So people need to have an inclusive political institutions so that their voices are heard, and that voices are then reflected into the economic structure as well. That's, I think, first the macroeconomic answer. The second answer, I would say, so that the economic policy is reoriented, right? The people, because right now the elite does not have any benefit in introducing these policies. In fact, they are benefiting themselves. A lot of these people who are the lawmakers, they're directly benefiting from these economic policies. They have these real estate businesses. They have these big businesses. Hospital is a business in Pakistan. Education is a business in Pakistan. So they want this type of system, and that has sabotaged our people. I mean, if you want to do business, why do you want to do business in? First of all, you can have a car industry or something. Are you so exploitive that you only have education or health? And most of the time they like it because it's very easy business. And it's also a business that will always ensure supply, because it's the basic need. So they deliberately go into that, and they're privatizing and they're making money out of it. So first of all, I think people need to have their voice heard. It's simply about the incentive structure. Who is making decisions? If the people who are benefiting from it, they will never make decisions in your favor. And now that requires inclusive political institutions so that the voice is transferred from the bottom to the top. The second, I would say, more procedural or more technical answer would be, I think that there's very lack of coordination between different departments that deals with these issues. So we have a labor department, one of the most underfunded departments, I would say. I was reading somewhere that, probably it might be an old figure, like
Okay.
not the most updated, but like we have like one labor inspector for 250,000 people in Pakistan or something like that.
Okay.
One of the lowest ratios. And so we need to have effective labor department, labor inspectors. And a lot of the times we, kind of give full leeway to these companies. We even sometimes don't allow labor inspections on these companies because we want foreign investment. We don't want to, create a business climate against the investors, especially the foreign investors. So sometimes we give a willful ignorance to these labor inspections, and we say that okay, you can deal with it, our laborers will not come. That's something we should never allow, and that happened, by the way, in early 2000s. We should allow labor inspections to be random, so that there is some kind of threat, and we need to have a very effective labor department. And that should coordinate with the National Commission for Rights of Children, that should coordinate with the child protection units, that should coordinate with the police. So all the departments that deal with the child labor and also the rehabilitation mechanism for the children, all these institutions should be having some kind of coordination pool. Right now there is none, as far as I'm aware. So that they don't work in isolation, and then we need to have really good funding, training, and capacity building measures for them. So I think that's a bare minimum we should do.
Okay.
So I think one is more macro answer, one is more micro answer.
Yes.
So I hope that satisfies.
Thank you so much, Shahzeb, for such an insightful discussion. And I believe this brings us to the end of our podcast. Again, really glad to have you. And I would also like to thank the audience. Please subscribe to our channel to watch more of our content. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.